Morning, everyone. Sorry I was a few minutes late. I had to update Zoom before we started. So how many people are here today? 13. Okay. Well, my name, let me just check everything's working okay. Chat box is good. Microphone is good. It's good too. It's recording. Okay. Let's close a few things. So, my name is Chris. Some of you might have done a workshop with me before on okay. Yeah. Hey everyone.
Hi there.
Everyone. That's everyone. 14.
How's it?
Hello. How you going, mate?
Hey buddy, how you doing?
I'm good. A few more people coming in. I'll set that up. Still coming.
I'll just mute myself.
Hello.
Yeah. Hello everyone. Yeah, you can mute yourself and yeah, when you want to ask a question, you can ask a question. It's fine. I'll just wait a minute to see if anyone else is coming in. 15. Pretty good. All right, I think that's everyone. If they show up a little bit late, I'll set them in. So, my name's Chris. I've done a few workshops for George's over the past few months during isolation. This is actually my last weekend, which I'm not doing nothing. So it's been a long time. Anyway, thanks for everyone spending their long weekend doing this. I'm sure there's a lot of better things you could probably do on a lovely long weekend, but I don't know, learning about Photoshop can be good as well. So today, what I want to first ask everyone, something a little bit different than what I do in the past is, and you can just put it in the text spot, everyone's knowledge of Photoshop. So if you're really new, just say beginner. If you think you're pretty decent, intermediate, and then if you think you're really advanced, just say advanced. Just so I have like a nice understanding of where I should start and how far I should take it. I'm assuming everyone's used editing Photoshop and Adobe stuff before. That's what I'm assuming. So yeah, it's a few beginners, a few intermediates, which is good. Okay, well that means I'll start. There's a few more beginners. That means I'll start from the start, and those of you who already know a little bit, I'm sorry about that, but I'm sure we'll catch up as we go through because we have a little bit of time to do this. Early yesterday, I uploaded a file to the Google Drive, which I hopefully George has shared with you. Did everyone get it? Just, all right. Not everyone get it. All right, so we'll share your file. What I'll give you guys is I'll give you the Google Drive link, and you should be able to download it. It's a PSD file. It's about 60 megabytes, so it should take a couple minutes to download. But I'll send it to you guys in a sec. Or someone else. So essentially what I'm doing is going through how I do editing from a real basic sense and turning those basic techniques into something really complex and interesting. 1 second. Essentially, how I edit is akin to being very, very good at coloring in, I'd say. There are a lot of features in the editing programs and a lot of features in Photoshop and Lightroom and Bridge. But it's like, which ones do you use? Which ones don't you use? Can you use them together? And the answer is there's 50 million ways to do one thing in Lightroom and especially in Photoshop. And if you get the same result at the end, sometimes the only difference is one might be a bit quicker or one might be a bit easier to understand or a few less options in it. So, and a lot of stuff I've learned just by practice. Not like I started learning Photoshop back in '98 when I was when I was a teenager. So that's kind of when Photoshop came about. So there were no YouTube channels telling what to do or stuff like this. So it was kind of very hands-on, basically just trying stuff and seeing if it works, and then having stages of my Photoshop where I was very slow and I was giving all my work a very over-edited look, which is something that a lot of people do when they start really getting into Photoshop, especially once they get past the beginner stage. They start to really edit their photos too much. If that makes sense. Like the colors are a bit too much and the sharpness is a bit too much. And hopefully from today I can help with that. I'm just trying to find this picture for you. Okay, looks like I'll have to upload it again. Let me just drag it in and I'll share you guys a screen as well. In terms of like before you start editing, which is before you start editing, which is like you're downloading your, let's say if you use Lightroom, your Lightroom organization and using the slider bars. That stuff is all very good and you can do a lot with it. But most of those programs, if you're using Lightroom or Camera Raw, which is in Photoshop, or if you're using Capture One, which is a more complicated program, or if you're even using stuff on your phone or your tablet, they're all very similar and they all involve using sliders and crop functions and straightening functions. But what I want to show you is all of this came from Photoshop. So all these functions from all these simple programs that you use come from Photoshop. And I want to show you the basics so you can understand that. And then when you start using everything and using Photoshop, you sort of know what to do. It's kind of like reading the alphabet before you can spell words, but it helps. And it's quite easy to learn. So that's that. All right, okay. I'm just going to upload this file for you guys. It's going in. So what I'm going to give you is, and feel free to muck around with it. Just play. Don't worry about what you do with it. Move things around. There's a lot of layers. And there's a lot of stuff going on. And this was, I think, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 15 maybe images it took to make this shot. And this was a cover of a magazine earlier this year. So I'm just going to create a link and share with anyone. I'm just going to copy it. I'm just going to put this in the chat and you guys can download. Just download, open that and download that. You should be able to download that. There we go. Done. All right. So while you guys are downloading that, I will open up, I'll share my screen. And I know. So at the moment I've got Bridge open. I just realized that I actually only use Lightroom on my iPad. I don't actually use Lightroom on my computer. The difference is because when I use Lightroom on my iPad is when I'm working as a photojournalist for like the SMH and doing stuff where I'm out and about and I have to be doing stuff on the fly. It has to be quick. I don't need very much editing, just a quick contrast, little slidey bar, and then I send it off. So Lightroom is very good for that on the iPad or the phone. It's very simple. It's, you don't have to think about it. Even if you're new to it, it's very, very intuitive. The options are very basic. Tomorrow I'll be doing a course on using your phone and your iPad or other tablet device. And I essentially use Lightroom to do most of what I do on that. So I figured, yes, tomorrow I'll do Lightroom and today I'll do more Photoshop. So when I'm on my laptop, it means I'm doing a shoot which is not as urgent. I end up, there's not as many photos to edit. There's usually only a few, like 2 or 3 for a job, rather than I was doing something on the iPad where I'd send quite a lot. So I like using Bridge because essentially you put your folders, it's just like a folder system. You can have your jobs, that's all from a week ago, and this is from yesterday, and this file here is what we're working on today. So it's very easy just to work on simple things, and it's a very basic attachment to Photoshop. And it works well with Photoshop, but it doesn't necessarily have all the bells and whistles that Lightroom does, because Lightroom's like a hybrid editing / organization program, whereas Bridge is just organizing your files. So I'm going to open up. So this was the cover. This was all shot, everything was shot separately. And I was, a little background, I was given the premise that we want these oysters to look like watches, shoot it like a watch ad, basically. And the original shots, if we can find them for you guys, probably in February, March cover. Yeah. There were 2 options for the cover. So all of the shots came from this original shoot, and the original idea was something along the lines of, let's say this. Imagine this, but with a bit black. So the background would be blacker and the cover title would go on. But I was like, that's not that good. So I had to figure out a way to create what I wanted to create, but without. And the only way I could think about doing it was using Photoshop. So here's another one, which is just it's a raw photo. It's closer to what we were thinking, but still there's no Photoshop there. So, sorry, just move out of the way, cancel. So I wanted to take it a step further. Someone's sending a message. Yeah, NEF is a raw file. So from those, I'll finish what I was talking. So that's where I started with this photo, this cover. I shoot everything I shoot, including on my phone, which is an iPhone. I shoot in RAW. So I use Nikon's, which give me an NEF, and my phone gives me DNG, which is an Adobe RAW conversion of the file. So if you have a Canon, I forget what Canon's RAW name is. Sony has the same. They all have the same. Essentially, what a RAW file is, for you as you don't know, is back in the day when we used film, and some of you might have used film, you have a negative. When you got into a dark room and you're printing your prints with the dark room, with the, I think the name of the machine that shines a light through the negative onto the paper. When you're in there, you could actually use bits of cardboard and use bits of stuff, move it around while the light's developing to change your image. And then when you're actually developing your film, so rather than going to Foxy Fast Photos and developing your film, you do it yourself in a little tub. And depending on the time and the temperature, you could actually make your film look lighter or darker, or maybe a bit of more contrast, depending on what type of film it was. So a RAW file is a very advanced version of a piece of film in a digital form, but it allows you to bring dark things really bright, bring light things really dark. Colors can go up and down a long way, as opposed to a JPEG or a TIFF file, because if you do it to those files, you're essentially destroying the image with everything you do. So that leads me to where I would start, is like, once you shoot your raw files and you get them onto your computer, first step is making sure every image you use, so open one image, open it up. This is Camera Raw, so everyone who uses Photoshop will see this. And I'll share this screen so you guys can see. I'll share my desktop, it's easier. Get it out of the way. I'm only working on one screen at the moment because my iPad's charging. So once that is got some charge into it, I'll be able to do two screens so I can see a bit more. So those of you, everyone, I'm assuming, has used Camera Raw if you've opened up a RAW file. So if you haven't, this is what it looks like. It's a slider-based function program. Got your exposure, your contrast, your highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, your texture and your clarity and your gaze is your sharpening tools, and you've got your vibrance, and you've got your temperature and your tint, which is getting your color temperature right. Those are the basic ones. That's where you should start. So when I'm doing the shot I took and ended up with, all I do in my raw editing is make sure I get the file as close as I can get to what I think I need. So I don't have to do as much editing in the Photoshop. So something like this, I know that it needs a bit more exposure because it was too dark to start off with. So by eye on my screen, and hopefully your screen's not too bright or has like a yellow cast or something like that. So hopefully if you've got like an Apple screen or a nice laptop screen, generally you should be pretty close to what it is, but I'll talk about that in a second. So I'll go down and I'll move my sliders where I think it's pure on your personal preference. So I think maybe I need a little bit more contrast. And you notice up here, I've already pushed the shadow up because when it started out, I actually shot the image a bit darker than it needed to be, purely because I wanted to make sure I didn't lose any detail in my highlights. So I'd go along, do this. I check that my blacks are too black and I want to be able to see them later on. If I need to cut them out, I'll need to keep them. So I'd push my shadows up so you can see how that does that. These two whites and black tools, I don't really use them very much, but essentially they just put more white into the white area, more black into the black area. It's a pretty crude slider, so if you can avoid that, avoid that. The main ones I use are these ones here. Shadows, don't you usually use too much contrast, because usually I add contrast in Photoshop. That's like the last step to bring the image to life. Highlights I will use, especially when I lost a highlight, especially there. It's always good to bring that back. So those tools are very good at bringing back things that you lost. And that's the ultimate benefit of a raw file, is you can do those adjustments without losing too much. And essentially what I'm trying to do is to get a nice, not too contrasty, evenly lit file, or you could say perfectly exposed file out for my editing. So I can add my contrast at the end. The color's okay. I always check my temperature. Usually when it comes out of the camera, you have it set at the right setting. If you have your camera on auto color temperature, it should put it in the right space. But if not, I find usually if you use auto, it's probably a little bit out, and you just by eye, just slide it around depending on what your screen looks like and get it right. And sometimes you might not like perfectly perfect color temperature, so no tint, no tone. Sometimes I do, so I'm like, oh, maybe I want everything to look a little bit warmer, and that's how you do that. Then I'll go down to these tools here. These are sharpening tools, but not conventional sharpening tools. These didn't exist when Photoshop or when RAW first came out. You had up here, you had your basic sharpening, which is here, which I don't like to use too much unless it's needed. Usually with the lenses and the sensors that we have on our cameras these days, if you get something really sharp, it's going to be really sharp anyway. And when you over sharpen things, that's where we go back to things looking over Photoshop. So be careful when you use that and try to avoid it if you can. But then you have these little tools here, which they're sharpening, but in a slightly different way. So texture, it does what it says. It's bringing out the texture. But see, if you go too far, it looks a bit fake. So with these tools here, just use a little bit. If you think it needs a little bit, add a little bit. If you don't think it, get rid of it. You can actually push it the other way too. So it makes everything a bit, texture go a bit blurry. So they are useful to have, but be wary of them. The one I probably use the most, which I only really started using in probably this year, is a bit of clarity. And I like it, one, because essentially what it does, it adds a bit of contrast, but not too powerful. And it makes things look a bit sharper. But also, Hold on, I've got to let some late people who came in. There we go. Oh, someone's back in. Yeah, so clarity is good. I like using clarity on like interiors and stuff because it makes, especially when you're shooting, like I shoot a lot of restaurants and bars at nighttime. So it adds a bit of grit and makes what could be quite soft and out of focus because it's quite dark, a bit more sharp. So I'd rather use clarity before you use any actual real sharpening, but there is a purpose for real sharpening. And then dehaze, it's an interesting tool, but essentially it is what it says. If you have a bit of flaring, or let's say you've shot in the fog and there's some trees or something in the fog, or you have a glass which is has a bit of like flaring or fog or mist on it. What this will do is basically we will take the areas which look a bit wishy-washy and white, and it will basically add black to that and make everything look a bit sharper and cut it away. So it can be quite useful when you have an image which for some reason or another you just didn't get it right on the day and you need just a little bit of cut through without doing that manually, because we used to have to do all that manually in Photoshop, whereas now you've got these tools that can make it a lot quicker for you. So those are the basic things that you should use on every raw image. And every image, even though you might shoot an image in a batch, you can, if we open up, cancel. If we open up, I'll open up this one here, these two. If we open up two, this is actually a crop of a larger image, as you can see. But if you open up two, yes, you can, I would, it's especially if it's the same shoot, I would select both of them and sync the settings, which is this. So basically this is all the different settings in Camera Raw. So what that does, it means you don't have to go through each one and adjust them as you go. So you just go select all, sync settings, and then if you have different crops on different images, you can untick these things. If you have different, well, it goes through colors, white balance, whatnot. But essentially, this first whole bunch here, you keep them the same. So what I do is I let the default thing do what it wants to do, and I go, okay. Now these two are matched up now. And then if I had 50 images, I go, okay, they're ready to go. But before I open them up or save them, I'll go down and I'll just clear that crop. I'll check that they're still similar. And, you know, because every image is different, even though if they're shot in a batch, they need little bits of difference. So maybe that one's a bit too bright. So I'll just turn that down. And then I'll go down and down and down and down until I finish go through again. And then they're ready to save. And that's a basic Camera Raw workflow. And then you don't open them up, because that means they'll open up 50 or 2 or 10 images in Photoshop. You save them, which is on the left-hand side. So you save them out, hit save, you select a folder. If you want to save as JPEG, which I generally do once I've done my Camera Raw process on an image, I will save them out as JPEGs. I won't save them out as TIFFs or PSDs, because if you have a lot of them, it takes up a lot of space. And the quality drop initially is not a lot, but a JPEG is a compressed file, so there is a loss. But if you go down to the file format section, after you've given your file a name, it's important to give your file a name, just for your own organization. You can have a high quality JPEG. So if you go up to here and make this 10 or even 12, the file will be a bit bigger, but you'll be able to get perfect print. If you're printing something really, really big, a high quality JPEG will get you a good quality print, and means you can send it over the internet without having to use up too much data, and you can download it easily too. That's pretty basic. Today, for most things, I keep it around 8. Pretty much reason because I keep it around 8. 8 is the highest, let's say, no, 8 is the lowest amount you can have it at before you start noticing things going wrong with your JPEGs. Anything below 8, you start to see funny things happening in, like, especially in skies and around sharp areas of images. You'll start to notice random artifacts happening. So if you keep between 8 and 12, that's good. And then the last two things are my color space, which I'll talk about in a second. I've got display 3, I'll talk about in a second. That's not the default. The default's sRGB or Adobe RGB, but I'll talk about that in a second. So I select my color space. 8-bit is what I want. You can do 16-bit in some profiles, but 8-bit's fine for me. 16-bit is just more data in the image, which makes the image bigger, which is not necessarily needed for most people. So it's good for printing files and stuff like that, but you don't necessarily need to use it on a day-to-day basis. So I'll go down, and then the last thing is basically sending out my file to how big I want it. I like using pixels, but you can use centimeters if you're old school, and you can pick that out. It tells you the megapixel. So even then, the file I was using, I think I was using a Z7. So the file was, I think it's 47 or 50 megapixels. It's telling me that what I'm saving it out as is only 13. So again, depending what you need, I know that most of the images in this photo are going on a magazine A4 size. So nothing really needs to be bigger than A4 for me. So around 4,000 pixels or 4,500 is plenty. Even if I need to zoom in, is plenty. I'd probably even have it around 4,000, to be honest, for something like this. Purely because these days, most of your images are not being printed big. Aren't going on billboards or big posters. Most of our images are going on the internet and on social media. So if you don't need to save your files out really big for the final purpose of them, if you're not going to print them, you don't need to. You're just wasting space. So keep that in mind. I do use really big images sometimes, but it's tough on your computer in terms of storage and in terms of performance, especially once you start editing with layers in Photoshop. So keep that in mind. The resolution is 300. Just keep it at that always, because if you do want to print something, 300 is generally the minimum print something at to get a good print. So just leave it at 300. And that's the default too. And then sharpening is basically, I'd never use this. So just stay away from it altogether, because you don't know what it's doing. You can't see a preview, and yeah, I wouldn't do it. And then you just go save, and you send it to where you want to send it, and that's your raw process done. Your basic raw process. So once you've got that, I'll go through a few of these tools at the top here, just so everyone knows what all these other tools do, because it can get a bit more complicated. And some of them you don't really need. You got your zoom, you got your hand, which is just dragging around. You got your eyedropper, which is your white balance. It does an automatic white balance. If you click on an area, like a white or a black, it'll give you an option. I don't like using that. I like doing it by eye because my screen, I know my screen is right. I know my screen is calibrated. And that's how I do it. I used to use the eyedropper, but I don't think you learn anything from it. It's almost too automated. So, and it's not necessarily quicker. And if you're clicking on multiple images in a set and you're clicking in different spots, or, you know, it might not work out. So you can use it, but I don't. So personal thing. So we'll just go back and we'll just synchronize that again. Easy. Next one is basically an information tool. If I'm clicking these different points, not really needed for most people, but it can tell you how bright overall an area is and the colors involved. For most people, and even for me, this is not very, doesn't really, you can see them change. But, you know, some people do it, but not us. This is actually a new tool here, which, okay, see what it does. Yeah, this is a shortcut to the HSL, which is the hue, saturation, luminance, and your curves. So basically all this is a shortcut that brings up these things over here. So that's your curve. Your hue is hidden in the HSL adjustment, and then the other ones are there, of course, as well. I'll get into those. That's a shortcut. You've got your crop tool, which I actually don't use, but it's a simple crop tool. I like to keep all my files and photos in the original format that they come in. And I don't crop them until I absolutely have to. If someone tells me I need to crop them, or if they're not fitting into something. Two examples would be they're not fitting into Instagram, so I need to crop them. And I'll do that at the end. Or if a client goes, the magazine's a bit shorter than that, I'll crop them. I'll do it at the end. I won't do it now. So I like to keep everything in that format. Okay, we're still good there. I'll show you how to do what I do. So I'll skip past this tool here. But before I do, with the crop, if you do use it, there are presets in the crop and customs. So a preset would be a ratio of 3 to 4. So basically all that does is it locks it off at that shape, that ratio. So if you need a square, if you know no matter what, everything's going to Instagram, 1-to-1, there's your square. So you can do that. You can make your own custom ones. You can show a grid in there. And you can clear it. So that's very basic. So for all those who want to use crop, if you know what your crop's going to be, fine, do it at the start. But how I use it is I go to my next tool, which is transform tool. This is a very manual tool. So it has all these different options. So we'll click on the first image. And I'll just reset everything because I had everything not at the right amount. So that's the original image. So I look at it and go, oh, I want to crop out this stuff on the edge. It's not very straight. We'll do that. So how I do that is I go into these tools and I rotate. So it's just simple sliding, and I do it by eye. If you're not sure if it's straight, down below you can punch up a grid so you can line everything up on the grid. And then I go, I want to zoom in a little bit. I use my scale to zoom in. So I'm zooming in there. And then I go, oh, it's not entirely centered, so I'll just offset it a little bit, and I can just move it side to side or up and down. Then if I've shot my photo and I'm not perfectly straight on, because I shoot a lot of products and objects and stuff in terms of, so I'm always, if I'm not on the tripod, I'm always worried if I'm straight. So there's two tools up here which are quite good, which are manual, basically bending the plane of the image. So if it's like that, because if I shot it and I was a little bit off, in Photoshop I can bring it to a more straight function. So that's what this tool does. So you can see how that works. We'll just turn that grid off so you can see. And you'll get, once you start using this, you actually start to notice that not every photo you shoot, especially of buildings or objects, or even people sometimes, is totally straight if you hand it, because people tend to lean when they take photos, and something like this can help a little bit in bringing that back. So that's how I crop. So I've kept my image in the same format as it started as, but I've got rid of the bits that I don't want. So it's a good place to start. Up the top here, these are automated functions. These are good for architectural photography. Basically, you click on one and it'll automatically try to do something. So this one's it's going to try and make everything perfectly straight, which in an image like this is quite hard because it's not a shot of a building. So it's good to try these. Sometimes these will work out, but often they don't. And then you'll have to go down here and do a manual version. If you don't like this step, it takes a little bit longer than a normal crop. But at the end, once you go through all your files, everything's nice and uniform. You have everything how you like. There's less to do in Photoshop because you've got a nice crop and composition. You've got your basic color and exposure and whatnot done. And then you save that. So highly recommend it. I only learned about this tool 2 years ago, and it's been really good. Really, it's made a big difference in just the overall consistency of my composition and my photos, and not making silly crops that I can't get back or I waste time on. It's always good to look at the image before and after to see if you've gone too far or not far enough, keeping that consistency, especially when you're doing an overall shoot and not just one photo. So that's a good tool. I'll just quickly go through the other ones, which I don't really use, but you can. The spot removal. Essentially, I like to do this in Photoshop because the tool is it's like the Lightroom version of the tool. It's a bit crass. It's not as, I don't know, there's not as much control. But essentially, you can click on an object and make it disappear. So you're basically airbrushing something out. There's two versions, there's heal and clone. These are both in Photoshop. They work better in Photoshop. I'd recommend doing them in Photoshop. But if you're in a pinch, especially if you're using Lightroom or if you're using Photoshop on the iPad, you can use this. And they both have that functionality. But for me, I don't like using it. So just so you know, you can do it. Next one's red eye. It's simple. You just put it across someone's eye and it gets rid of the red. And then you adjust these sliders until the red eye goes away. So it's good if you're doing lots of family photos or pictures at nighttime. It's good to use. The next one is a masking adjustment tool. Again, it's something I like to use in Photoshop, but I'll show you what it does. If I draw a line across and then I use my slider, you see how it's just affected where I've drawn or I've masked along. So I can do color as well. So I can bring the color up in that little section. Purpose of this tool is if in every spot in say 10 photos, there's a spot which is too dark or doesn't have the right color. You can do an automated function across all of them. So if you go select all and you sync everything and then go, yeah, they'll both have that same adjustment on it. That looks silly, of course, but just to show you what that function does. But we'll delete that. I wouldn't say I use that too much. Again, if I'm in a pinch and need to do something really quickly, it can be useful, but it's a very crude tool. In ways it's not, and the way I say crude, it's really the brushing that you do. It's not very intricate and precise. So we'll go back out of that. We'll just bring these back. And when you want to get rid of that stuff, you always need to click on the tool, click on the little thing that you did and press delete and it goes away. The next two tools, I use these a lot. The first one is a gradient tool. So if I know that the right side of my image is always too dark in these images, I will set my gradient up. So I'll grab the tool, I'll draw, so green is where you start, red is where you want to go to. So I know this image is a bit dark on one side. It's also a bit dark on the bottom, so I can do multiple. So I've done two. And then these tools, I can, again, the same as that brushing tool, I can just click on them and brighten up. Also, you can use colors, like see how this is a bit blue, whereas this is a bit more neutral. I'll just add a little bit of color temperature into that black to make it match up with this a bit more. Maybe it's a bit green as well. So I'll use this quite a lot. Again, the reason why I can use it is because I'm still working on my raw file and I'm not destroying the image in Photoshop. So I'm getting as much as I can done before I open them up. Very, very handy tool. And then there's also a second version of that, which is, it's a circular gradient. This is very good for isolating odd things in images, a person's face, an object. If you want the highlight, because you want to focus on that. Many of you might know about vignetting, where they bring darkness comes in around the edges of the camera or the shot. This is a more selected vignetting. So I'm going to click on that. So what's happening here is everything outside the circle is adjusting. So if I wanted to just focus on this oyster, I can darken the rest like that, and then go back to my original sliders and muck around with it. Essentially, all I've done is highlighted one oyster. You can do that with color. Any of these tools you can use, basically. So, really good tool for portraits. And don't use it too much, just a little bit around the head, and then it can fall off. Really simple way just to give your images, especially if you have some good depth of field in your shot, this can like accentuate it a bit more. So, and it's totally manual. You can just change the size of it, shape of it, and you can use all these features here. You can adjust. And you can even change the feather, which is how soft it blends in. So if you go down here, you can change that down here. So a good tool to use. I recommend everyone use that tool. These are the preferences, rotating, deleting, and full screen. So those are those tools there, which are good. So you notice how we haven't actually opened up Photoshop yet. We're still going through this, and you're getting your file closer and closer to being done, but you haven't done Photoshop. Very important that you do as much as you can in this. So once we've done all our basic things, we've cropped, we've rotated, done that, there are some other options. So curve. This is where your contrast can happen. If you want to do your contrast right now across all images, this is a very manual and precise way of doing it. Essentially, if you move your slider, you can see the curve move, and you can see what's happening in the image. Highlights are going down, which is probably needed. Light is the lighter pixels, not the white pixels. So again, I'm just going to make this image really flat, but you can see how I've made the image really flat with this curve. So I've gone the opposite way. But then if you want your image to be very contrasty, you can also do that too. And again, all this is just by eye, just seeing what I think looks half decent. So we've got a curve there. It's an odd curve, but I'm doing it. Most curves are a nice sort of like curve or like a zigzag, like that. That's what the contrast is. You don't really have to worry about this sort of stuff too much, but you can see how you have ultimate control over what you're doing by using these curves. You can also use a point, which is basically you click a point on the curve, and most of you who are intermediate will probably be more used to this. So that's a flat curve, and then you've got your contrasty curve, highlights, whatnot. You can delete those. Go back to where we were. So yeah, if you want to do your contrast in RAW, do it here. Very manual. You do have the basic contrast tool, which in a pinch is okay. Nothing wrong with it. But if you want things to be nice, precise, and do them across all your images and have it nice and consistent, here's a good place to start. And you have these tools up here, which basically just, they don't do too much, but you can move everything around. That's your curves. Sharpening, if you want to. If you're worried that your image is not sharp enough, yes, add some sharpening. A good rule of thumb with sharpening is probably keep your settings lower than what you think. If I was to do this, let's have a look. Let's zoom in. And you can see the sharpening really basically sharpen those pixels, which I don't think is that great. But see how 0 compared to 40, there's a little bit. So I'd say keep your sharpening, if you're going to use it, between 0, if you can, and 40. If you have to go higher than that, you probably shouldn't be using that image. But if you really need to, then keep that around 40. Your radius, keep that around 1. And that's basically, sharpening is the amount, the radius is, I'll show you the difference in radius. It basically works with the amount. So you can see it sharpening the pixels as well. Keep that around 1. And these two here, basically is if you've over sharpened your image and you slide these around to detail, it sharpens it even more. Again, try to keep it low, but you can see what it's doing. And you can see how now I can see all these pixels and these little artifacts in this here. I don't like that. It looks fake. But if I get rid of that, it's back to how it was before. So be very careful with this. But then the next one is a masking tool. So it brings everything back. So if you slide that on, it basically keeps the changes, but then blurs it back up again. So it's destroying what you just did, but it's keeping some of the changes again there. Again, it does make things look a bit fake. So if you can avoid it, please do. But if you do need to do sharpening, I reckon that would be an okay setting. 4120. It's just a little bit. And then these other ones here are for noise. So if you have a really grainy image, again, it will basically try to get rid of the grain. So what it's doing is actually blurring the image. So if you put this up and then you move these bars around, you can see subtle differences in the grain. Although there's not too much grain in this image, but if you had a really grainy image, detail is a detailed, contrast color. It's pretty specific what it says. You can see this one here is getting rid of it, takes a bit of color out, and same. Very minor. Generally, it's only needed if you've shot your image at a really high ISO and you need to get rid of some grain. But that's what all that does. So you know. There are things in Camera Raw where you can save your settings and then load them onto a new batch of images that you might do later. So you just save what you've done and load them out. You can also export your settings into a little file called an XMP, which you can copy onto a hard drive or a computer and then store it. And then a year later, you can come back. What about that shoot I did with the oysters? I really like the settings I used on that. Maybe they'll work on this shoot. So you can save that out. So all the settings are saved. So you can do that. And then you also, in this little tool section, you can set everything back to how it was. Now, the last two tools that I actually use in RAW, the ones I don't use are snapshots, but basically you can record a snapshot of where you are in your process. Presets, these are all built-in presets. You can make your own. So if you, again, it's pretty much like a preset in Lightroom. If you make a setting that you like and you want to keep it, you press the little button down here, and then you save everything you want to keep, and you call it something you want to keep, and it saves it, and it'll keep it in here. So I know all photographers, you guys all have things that you like doing when you're editing. So to remember it, maybe the first few times, save it. I think generally after a while, most people form habits in Photoshop and they just remember it and they keep on doing that, what they like. So they don't necessarily need the preset as much, but it's still good to have. Don't worry about the calibration. And then the last three, don't worry about the split toning. It's not needed. It's just a complicated thing that doesn't need needed. We have our standard grain effect, which I don't use too much, but if you want to make your image grainier, you can do that. This one here, and then the one below is vignetting. I'll zoom out and I'll show you that. You can do some vignetting if you haven't already done that with our gradient tools. If you are going to do vignetting, it's also nice to do it as a raw file, especially if you have skies or a big block of light color. Because when you try to lighten and darken sky or a color in Photoshop, you can start to get these banding lines through your image. So if you do it in RAW, there's less chance of that happening because it's a raw file. So if you are going to put some vignetting through your sky or image or bright, do it in RAW. So the cropping, there's a few options here, but basically the amount is how dark it goes or light it goes. The midpoint is how tight the circle is. And I'll show you as in white, you can see how tight the circle goes with your midpoint. Roundness is what it says. It goes from a square to a perfect circle, depending on what you're trying to highlight and emphasize, because that's what vignetting does. It brings your eye to what you want them to look at. Feather, again, you can see what it's actually doing. So yeah, that's the vignetting tool. It's good to use. It's very good for portraits, I'd say. Vignetting is very good for portraits, but you can use it on all types of photos, landscapes, architecture, objects, documentary photos, like street photos. It can be used. Again, with all these tools, it's very good to use in moderation. Don't go too far, because then people will know you've done that. The premise of what we're doing here is to make your photo look like you took it like that, basically. Like, when you go on the internet and Instagram, or even some camera magazines which exist, you see images and they're just too overdone. They're too Photoshopped. They're too fake. So what I'm trying to do with this now is just trying to get you as much editing as possible done and make it look like you actually shot it out of the camera that way. So be mindful of moderation on all these tools. Don't go too far. There's two more in Camera Raw. And again, all these tools in Camera Raw are in Lightroom. Every single one. There might be a couple of ones that are not in there, but pretty much all of them are in Lightroom. And a lot of these sliding tools are in multiple phone and iPad applications which aren't Adobe. It's kind of universal. Like Adobe was the first company to do it, but then everyone else knocked them off. And there are programs that look exactly like Lightroom, but aren't Lightroom. So once you've learned these basics, you'll be able to use any camera editing or photo editing program, because they're almost universal. The second last one I want to show you here after this split toning, which we don't use, is a HSL. This is very, very good if you want to specifically address a certain color. And I like doing this a lot. So in this image here, there's yellow. I want that yellow. Firstly, I want it to be a bit more orange. So I'm going to slide my yellow slider across. That's only affecting the yellow in the image. Secondly, I want my yellow to be more saturated, more colorful. So I'm going to slide that up too. And you can see how I can isolate a color. And again, always better to do this in RAW than in Photoshop. There we go, that's nice and yellow. And then the last one is a luminance. So I can go, wait, I want that yellow to be a bit darker, or I want that yellow still to be quite yellow, but brighter. So it's probably at best a little bit darker, saturation, a bit higher, and the hue, maybe a bit more orange. So very powerful 3 tools there. And again, you can do it batch across both images or all your images. So you go select all, you go sync. And the beauty about synchronizing all your things is that I can go check none, find the one I like, which is HSL was what you were doing, click on that and go okay. And then it's done that across both images. Very, very handy tool. So remember that one, write that one down. Again, it will give the quality and consistency across your images and that make your files just look better once they come out of RAW. All right. Now the last tool in RAW, or this I want to show you, which is this one here. It is what it is, says it is. It's a lens correction. I use this a lot when I use my 35mm lens, because my Nikon 35mm lens, like in the image behind me, it distorts the shot a bit. So there's a manual and a profile version. If you go and enable, it actually remembers, see my 35mm, it actually remembers my distortion. And what it does, it just does a automatic distortion on it, but you can also do a manual correction with that profile. So you can see how the image is changing. If that's not working, you go to manual, and then you can do manual. So you can see how you can fix distortion. Defringing and that stuff, don't worry about it, but essentially what defringing is you might see some color. If your image is over sharpened, or for some reason, you might see some weird colors around the edges of the sharpening of the sharp points of your image. Defringing, what that does is that will, if you use these sliders, it will neutralize that color. But with digital cameras, how they've got so much better, this happens a lot less. It still happens, but happens a lot less. So if you ever have that problem, just use these slider tools and I'll get rid of it for you. So those are all the tools. Let me just get this down a bit brighter. Those are all the tools that I use to get my photo roughly where I want it. And in the end, I'd always just look at it at the end and go, well, maybe I need to change that back again. And they go, there, okay. So that's editing in RAW. The last thing I do is I'd save it out, which I showed you before. If you're just opening it up, down here, you click on that. It's very similar settings to the save as, but this is what it will do when you open up and press open. So that's what it will open up as. So you can adjust that as well, like we've adjusted over there. So we'll just, I don't want to because that's a really big file. So what I do is I just save it out. I can actually hit save. There we go. So let me just check the key. Let me just go zoom for a second. So if there's any questions, because that was a big section. Couple questions. One question. So Camera Raw and Lightroom, it's the same thing. So Camera Raw was invented first, and then Lightroom came along. But it's the same technology, it's the same software. They've just adjusted it into a different program. You're not getting any, usually when they update Camera Raw, they update Lightroom. The sliders are the same on Lightroom. I don't have Lightroom on this computer, but I have it on my iPad, as I said before. But there is no difference. You should be able to get the exact same result. There might be a couple of different options that aren't there, but if you're using Lightroom and not Camera Raw, totally fine. But as I said, all these options are there in Lightroom. How I open images again. So what I'll do, if you want to open a single image, go open image, and that'll open up in Photoshop. If you want to save it into a folder for later, you go save, you select your folder, you select your name, you select JPEG or TIFF. I always use JPEG. You can also save it as a second raw file, which is, and with those settings, which is interesting. You can do that, but don't do that too much. I select my color space, I select my size, which as you can see is around A4 size. And then if I have sharpening, which we've done in this, that is automatically selected, and then you hit save. And then it goes out, and you can go, and then you can go done. And then where we go down to here, there's our file. And we open up and we're in Photoshop. So that's that. So for most of what you guys do, that should be enough for you to use your picture. If you make sure you spend enough time in Camera Raw or Lightroom, the sliding function. Once you get through that, your file should be kind of ready to go. But there are always things that you can do in Photoshop that you can't do in Lightroom and you can't do in Camera Raw, which we will get to. So, for those of you who haven't seen Photoshop, this is Photoshop. I'm sure most of you have Photoshop now, because you want to learn about it. Let me just minimize this. Okay, I'm just going to share Photoshop. Before you start working in Photoshop, one thing I would do is set it up properly. So how we do this is we go to our preferences. There's two things I want to look at. First of all is my performance. Now, I've got mine set at 70%. Because I've got quite a bit of RAM, but you can move this around depending on if you have a faster computer or a slower computer. But basically, is what it gives your program, what it allows your program to use on your computer. So if you want your Photoshop to run a bit faster and really push it up. That can bring its own problems because it means where the rest of the computer won't be doing much in the background. So make sure it's around 70, 80. If you really want to push it up. That's your RAM. And then scratch disk is make sure your Photoshop has a large amount of space on your computer to do things. So when you open up a file in Photoshop, it actually creates a second version of the file in Photoshop, but it's temporary. So you need lots of space for your Photoshop to run quickly. So I've still got 2.4 terabytes left on my laptop. So it's heaps of space, so I can have really big files and my computer won't chug too much. Eventually it will start chugging, but if you don't have a lot of space on your computer, you'll notice it in Photoshop, because it's one of the most, like video editing, it's one of the most draining things on your computer, because it's using the video card and it's using the processors. So make sure those two things are set. The rest of the things are pretty okay how they are. You can always go in and change things, but quite complicated. Unless you're very specific on something, there's lots of different options and rulers and colors and things. I generally only touch those two things. And then I go, okay, so that's set. I'll go back to my preferences again. I'll check this for my camera raw, which we could have done at the start, but again, I just want to make sure that this isn't set too low. It's at 20 gigabyte, which is basically, again, when you're doing camera raw, it's creating files that are temporary and it needs space to do that. If you don't have a lot of space, if you have this set at 1 gigabyte or 1 megabyte, it will slow down and be very stupid. Usually the default is set is good, but if it's not for some reason, change that. Most of the things, the default should be correct. And then one more thing. We've got here is color settings. Again, all this stuff looks quite complicated. The main thing I'm worried about is my working space, which I've clicked on. This is your color profile. So this is important because this means what you see on your computer or tablet or device, someone else can see it in the same profile, which means you're, depending on how good the quality of their screen is, it should be pretty close to what you've got. A big problem probably in the past, since digital photography started, was color profile. People would have older screens, different brand screens, and then when phones come in, people use different phones, and what that was giving us was different colors in images that you were seeing to someone else. So my image could be perfect on my screen, but my mate's, who's the printer, would get the image and it'd be yellow. Or mine would be perfectly contrast, but when it goes to my mate, it's a bit dull and dark for some reason. So that comes back to your color profile. It has got a lot better over the years where we don't really have to worry about it too much. And which is a good thing. There are 3 main profiles, well, and there's a 4th, which is more for pro photographers. We have the original sRGB, which is designed for web. So imagine millions and millions of colors. A color profile is made and is limiting the amount of colors in that image. Most Android products will use sRGB, especially, and you can set it up in your camera as well. Most cameras will use sRGB as their profile. Adobe in 1998 made their own profile, which is a little bit bigger than sRGB. So a few more colors in it. That's all it is. It used to be the standard of basic color profile. And then there is Pro Photo, which is what I would use if I was doing a very big print. it is a very big profile with a lot more colors. However, it doubles the size of your photo. So be wary when you use that. And this is not the file we're setting up. This is the working space. So if your file is a different, say your file is sRGB and you're using Pro Photo RGB, there's going to be a clash. So you're going to have to assign that new profile in your Photoshop and then save it out as the profile you want. Once you set this up, you shouldn't have to think about it again. Once you have your camera, your Photoshop, and where you're sending it, you should never have to touch this again. You only generally touch it when you change cameras or change computers. You need to check it or update things. I use Image P3. This is a profile made by Apple. And Apple, well, I don't know if Apple made it, but they use it. It's their profile. And the reason why I use it is because all my devices are Apple. So what I see on my laptop is the same as what I see on my phone, is the same as what I see on my iPad. And most of the people, a good, let's say a good half, I don't know, I think a lot of people use Apple products, especially on their phones. So I know a good percentage of people look at my work, the color and the contrast is going to be pretty close. People use Android and other devices. It will still be pretty close, but it won't be as exact. But that's what happens when you have competing brands. There's nothing you can do about it. So you just pick one side. I picked Apple, and I'm sticking with that profile. So I used to have big problems with people getting images of me and them being, mainly them being too light or too dark because of my profile on my screen. So past couple of years, I addressed that, and I've stuck to one system across everything. And it made, with the Apple profile, it made it easier for me to understand that I know that what I'm seeing is what I've done. So that's what I've picked. So I find that and pick that. All these other ones here for printers, for various things, don't worry about that. That's just for if you're a professional printer and you need to get things right. So I've done that, it's already saved. So you set that up. Once you do this, forget about it. And also, sorry, I gotta find the right shot. Where were we? Yeah, down here. When you're in Camera Raw, you can assign a profile. So down here, you can do it. Select, display 3. So even if your camera is shooting sRGB or Adobe RGB, you can start off when you open the file in RAW and save it out. You can change it to the profile you want. Once you set this, it saves it. So when you keep on doing more shoots, you don't have to worry about changing it all the time. So you've set up your workflow. And then when you save it out and save again, you can do that here. Display 3. So that's your color profile. Once you've done it, forget about it. Yeah, all right. So I'm going to close that image. I go to, did I give you guys the right image? Let's have a look. Yes, I'm recording this video, so you can definitely watch this again. I will not be watching it again, but you guys can definitely watch it again. So now we're in Photoshop. Thousands of tools, thousands and thousands of tools. I'm not going to show you all the tools, of course, but I'll show you what I use. A good thing about Photoshop is basically you can always learn more. There's always different techniques and things. I mean, I've been using Photoshop since '98, so that's a long time. And there's tools I never used before. Never ever used before. So if you feel like you're struggling and there's so much to learn, there is, but you don't have to learn everything. You just need to learn the right tools. So I just want to move this around. Maybe my iPad's charged up enough. I can still going. Here is our Photoshop, and I'm just going to make it a bit smaller on my screen so I can actually see what I'm doing. It does help to have two screens when you're editing, if you can. Not necessary, but it does help. So we have our file, which is not a single image, of course. It looks like a single image at the end, but it came from all those oyster shots I showed you before. Essentially, I went through all those shots and found the best bits and pieces that I liked and that I needed. So I initially wanted to find some hero oysters, different orientations, back and front. And then I went through and found some different bits of ice. Again, different sizes and shapes. And then I copied them all in. So if you have the folder open, you can go over to your layers, which is a very important thing in Photoshop. It's probably the most used tab, apart from your tool layer over here. Super, super important, especially when you're doing a highly complicated image, which is not all the time. Sometimes you're not actually using your layers. You're just doing a bit of touching, a bit of maybe getting rid of a few spots of dust, or doing a little crop or something like that. But if you're doing something highly complicated, you need your layers. So I'll just turn the layers off so you can see how the image came together. So everything's on its own little layer. It's kind of nifty. Then we're over the black. So go to one of the oysters. We'll find an oyster. Where's a good one? There we go. So once I've opened my image in Photoshop, and I'm not sure which file I started on this image, but essentially I'm going to reverse engineer what I've done to show you some tools in Photoshop that I use all the time, and then you should incorporate into your work. So when I open up an image, I like to, and I'm going to adjust something or do something complicated like this. I like to turn things, I like to use masks, which is this little thing here. So that's my picture. Here's my mask. To create a mask, you go down to this little tool here, and it makes you a mask. And essentially the mask is what we did in Camera Raw, where you have you paint out the areas that you don't want to be adjusted or edited. So you can see in my little mask here that the black areas are where I've cut out my oyster. So I turn off my black background. I turn off my shadow effects. All I've got here is an oyster that I've selected and then I've cut out. And then if I go on to my mask tool and I undo what I have done, which I've added black, if I find my tool, which is my painting tool, and I change my size, which is up here. As you can see, I've cut this out of another image. There we go. Just make sure I get all of it. So there we go. Our mask is now white, where it started. So we can delete that. Now we're back to where it started. So this would be one of the images that I saved out in Camera Raw, saved them all out in that shape, and then I've plonked them all in, one at a time, and edited them. You can see I've got the color and the contrast, everything's good to go. I did that in Camera Raw, and then I did a little filter thing at the end across all of them, which I'll show you. But I want to show you the masking tool. So imagine this is the only layer. You have this and your black. That's all you have. That's your image. And you want to cut your object out and put it into your image, which is a very specific thing to Photoshop. It's very much if you are compositing and creating an image, but you can use this technique of masking all throughout Photoshop, not just on erasing and bringing things back. You can use it on darkening an area and lightening an area by using the mask. So imagine I want to darken the area all the way around the oyster, but not delete it. You can do that with a mask, but you still need to draw the shape. So most of layers and masking and effects in this tablet, this layers tablet, it's all about basically coloring in within the lines and drawing. So you have to be very good at drawing. There are selection tools which make that quicker. In this shoot or this photo, however, I did everything manually because it was on a front cover. I wanted it to be perfect. It wasn't like multiple images me sending out this needed selected. So I started off manually. And once you learn the manual tools and you start to use the auto tools with it, it gives you an understanding of what works and what doesn't work in the situation. But I want to show you how it actually works. So I got my image, I hit my mask, bang. Get my brush over here, bang. Big part about editing and masking with your layers is your brush selection size. And the fact that you should always be constantly changing your size depending on the shape that you're cutting out. I'm going to make my brush a bit smaller. And the hardness is how soft and how hard it is. So very hard. I get black. So you paint black onto white. It's a perfect circle. And then I go really soft with no hardness. It's a bit blurry. So these are very good depending on what you're doing. If you're cutting something out really hard, I'd probably recommend using the harder brush. If you are blending something in, it could be like, I don't know, like any object. Like if you're blending in, a good one is actually, you know, wedding photographers do the big group shots. And they take a few shots, but the reason why they do that is there's always one situation or a couple of people who aren't looking, or they're blinking in one of the photos, but in the second photo, they're blinking, but everyone else doesn't look right. So a good method to blend them in is to cut the photo out like this, plonk it on that image, and then softly erase around their head till it sort of fits, looks like it's real. So that's where a soft brush is quite good. But for this situation, we're going to use a hard brush, but not fully there. So it's a little bit, it's a tiny bit blurry on the edge. And essentially what I want to do is, this looks mundane, but basically just go around the edge. Now you can just do clicks like that, just so you know, but you can also do hold shift and it gives you straight lines. I find that's just easier to do. So basically you go around and you cut out your object. So if you guys want to try this on your file, try it, just so you can get a feel for it. If you're using a tablet with a pen, that's always good too. You can make it a bit easier. It feels more like drawing. Some people get RSI from using trackpads or using their mouse. But you can see this can be a bit time consuming, but I want you to understand the manual nature of it. And then when you do the automated version, you get an understanding of what it actually is doing. And then when you look at an image, you'll go, actually the automatic selection tool won't work on this, because in this case, the difference between the darkness and the colors is not much, and the tool will probably not work. And I'll show you that. So that's what I do, or I did for all those images. I go around and cut them out or mask them out. So it's not deleting the image. The pen tool. Someone asked about the pen tool. I used to use the pen tool all the time, but I got faster at using the brush tool. I got jack of the pen tool. I'll show you the pen tool, but essentially when I'm editing, as I said, there's multiple ways to do one thing. And what the pen tool is, I'll show you it. It is here. We can create a mask like we did, but it remembers. So we can go around the edge. We'll just do this fake. You can make your shape. And it will remember. It will create a path, and then you can select that path and cut out your tool. Now, I don't like using it. It's a very bigger thing designers like using. People think it's more accurate, but there's areas where it's not. Purely as you can see, it's a straight line, lots of little dots. However, the edge of this is not a straight line. So where this would just do like a straight line cutout, I go to my brush tool, and the quicker you get at this, you can actually keep the object. So I'm not doing a straight line. I'm just doing a little bit bent, a little bit wobbly to go along with how the oyster actually is, just so it doesn't look as cut out. So yes, it's not as precise, but in another way, it actually is more, gives the image what you're cutting out, more authentic look, because very rarely is something a straight edge. And to do lots and lots and lots of little pen tools to make that nice curvy edge is a pain in the ass. It takes longer. This is much quicker. It's free flowing. If you muck something up, just go undo. Very, very quick. Like little corners like this. See, I'm always changing the size of my brush. Just going around and get a feel for it. And because I know that the edge of this oyster is not perfectly straight, I can muck up a little bit and it's okay. I'm just constantly moving it along. So that's the difference between the path tool and the brush tool. And that's the reason why I like using it. Again, this is what I like doing and what I've learned works for me. It gives me a better result in the end. The path tool is very good for designers. Graphic designers love using it. Someone asked a question. What's the keyboard shortcut for changing your brush size? So it is, if you go underneath the delete button, there is backslash, and then there's two brackets next on the left of that. That is up and down. So I'm pressing the right square bracket and now I'm going the left square bracket. So you can be constantly changing that while you're going along. And that's the shortcut. So it's very good to do. So I'll go along, I'll finish this off quickly. Again, this is me sliding just on the trackpad with my finger. I've got a feel for it. Again, it's like I'm coloring in. Just going along. So that's the most manual selection, or when you're doing masking, you can do that with the pen tool. I want to show you here how to use some of the automated tools, because this little area of the image is quite good. Now, how the automated versions work is they basically select the difference between the color, the light pixels or the dark pixels, or two different colors, and they separate them. And they select the one you clicked on. We go up from our brush tool, which is here, and we move up to our selection tools, which is here, here, and here. You want to go to this one here with the little sparkles on it. Now it has three things. It has object, which is a new one, which is quite good. Essentially, you click on your original layer, you select, and because the difference between the black and the reds and the whites and the blues is quite stark, it's done a perfect job in selecting the bit of the image we don't want. So like, that's perfect. So I'm just going to paint that in. And then leaves a little line. It's not perfect always. It's good. And you can always, that's a very good one to use. And you can always check where your mask is by actually hitting backslash, which is a shortcut. So hit backslash. You can see where you've been doing your editing, and undo it. So if you think you missed something, like say there's a little bit of there, but it's very faint, you can't see it, you can see it. So that's a good thing to remember, backslash. Actually here, see? There's a little bit there I missed, which is the perils of using your brush and not using one of the automated selection tools to start off with, because you might miss something. See, I missed a couple of spots. But if you start off using the automated one and then go to the manual one, you'll get a better result and be less backtracking. But I'm doing this in reverse. So the next one is quick selection tool. Again, a very good tool. It's a plus and minus. And a beginning bit. So basically you select where you want it to select your object. And you see it's already having a bit of a problem because it's not, I wanted to get rid of this little bit here inside the oyster. So I'm going to have to go to its more manual options and go minus. And essentially what this does, it sort of like you click and make sure you keep changing the size of your brush for the size of the job. But if you click, it kind of is trying to undo. It's trying to find an edge. But because the color and the contrast here are not great in terms of difference, it's really struggling. We'll try it again, see if we can get it to work. Sometimes if you use a smaller brush, it can be better. No, it's still struggling a little bit. So you can see how this can get annoying when you know when it's not working. That's why I say it's important to learn the manual way of doing it. So when you look at an image, you know if you could use that tool or not. So if things are too similar, like here, it might not work. But if you have a black square on a white background, of course it's going to work. So I'm not going to use that in this situation because it's not working. I'll try the magic wand tool. Now again, it's a very automated thing. It says to click and see what happens. So we clicked and it's not doing it perfectly. I'm going to adjust its tolerance, which is up here, which is basically how strong the tool is. At the moment, it's quite weak. So I'm going to make it a bit stronger by sliding up. See how it's done a little bit? It's kind of okay. It's kind of got the line that we want. I'm going to hit shift and try again and click again. It's done a little bit. Shift again. See, this is getting a bit jacked. Now it's lost me. So again, see, it's these blacks are actually part of the oyster, but I want to keep them. I don't want to get rid of them. So that's where that tool isn't working that well. But at least you get to see those are the three automated tools. So when you're selecting something, those are the three tools you use. And then if that doesn't work, you do what we're doing now, and you can make a mask, or you can do a pen tool, which makes a selection, which you can turn into a mask. So there's like 5 different options of creating a mask from selection, or just making a mask straight away without selection. A photographer once said to me that good Photoshop is essentially about good selections and good masks, because everything in Photoshop runs off that, basically. And you get into habits of doing very things. Like I got into the habit of using the brush tool instead of the pen tool, just because of personal preference. And it works well with my workflow. I know some of you beginners might find that just using this tool, these selection tools, or even like the basic, like just selecting a circle and cut and doing that, like you might find that works for you, and you'll get into the habit of doing that. Anyway, we're going along. Let me just finish this off because it's almost done. It's almost back to where it is. And now I know this image that it's going on black. If this was going on white, I'd have to really be careful, because even though I'm masking out the black around the edges, if this was on a white background or a different color, there still might be a little bit of black showing up on the edges, and that will show up if I'm on a different color background. So once I get rid of this, I'll show you what I mean. Again, this is not the fastest way to do something. This is just the most basic way to do something. So that's done. And turn my black layer on. And we can see how it looks like it's there. You know, it's not part of an image, but there's no off bits. It still looks sharp. It's got a nice sharp edge. That's very good. It's kind of where we started. What would it look like on a white background? Just so I can show you guys, just so you can get an idea of how things can be. See, it's pretty good around the whole image, but you can see there's a little bit around the edges, so you can still see a little bit of black, which is annoying because we spent all that time cutting it out and we didn't get it perfect. If you don't want to go back and do it again and go around those edges, which you could if you wanted to, there is a automated tool that will help. So write this one down, remember where it is. So if we go back to our layer and we click on our mask and our selection, and sorry, I'm in Photoshop. And if you can't see your selection, what this little mask thing in the corner is actually doing, if you go right option, you can see it. That's what we've done. And then if you go control and click on it and go to add or select any of these ones, you can go add. It's actually showing, it's selected what you've done. So you can see it. You can copy, you can paste it, you can do all those things with it, but that's just showing you what you've got there. We'll deselect that. I want to show you this tool. So this tool is up on the top bar. If you go select, because we're in a selecting phase of our editing at the moment, and we scroll down to here, and that is, as on Apple shortcut, it is Option Command R. We select that. You can see it's hide selection. Now, this is a very interesting tool because it basically allows you to refine the edge of your selection with some very easy to use tools. So for the problem we're having here is our edge is still a bit black around here and here. So I'm going to shift this line, which is going around the edge of my object. I'm going to contract it. So it's going to take off a sliver of the edge of the image, but keep it in the same shape. Let's zoom in. Okay, there we go. It's cut in a tiny bit. And if you can't see that, I'm going to go all the way the other way. Do you see it? It's moved the edge. So now I've got a perfect edge. My one concern is that it might be too sharp, like it's cut into my image. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to smooth it a little bit. Okay. Then I'm going to go, all right. Now, in terms of showing you guys the difference, I just want to go up to my history tab, which you can go window history, which is, yeah, or it's that little tab over there. But essentially what this is recorded all the brush strokes and all the clicks that I've done. So I can always go back if I need to. But to show you what I've done, I want to see is I've done a select and mask. I just want to show you the selection, how I've refined it. And I've got rid of that. So now if I was putting this on white, I could. So that is a nutshell how you go from selecting and masking something to how you want. And for this situation, it's not to select a color or lighten or darken something. It's just basically to cut something out. So we're going to change our background back to black. Any questions about the masking and the selecting options? Again, you could, this is recorded, so you can watch it again, but if there's anything jumping out at you, just chuck something into the text and I can answer it for you. Good, no questions. All right, so essentially what I did with all those images in this shot was, same with the ice, piece of ice, and oh, I gotta turn back on. Where is my image? Right. Because this image, this entire image, once I created it, as you guys got it, I actually animated the whole image. And there were bits of the image were on top of each other, as you can see in the image. So I needed to create some shadow in the image, like here. So I've turned those two layers on. I created a little bit of shadow, so I can find and bring it up. There it is. See there? I've created a fake shadow because the object is below. That's just me thinking, if someone's looking at this, I want to make it look as real as possible. I need a shadow in there. So you can create that in Photoshop if you don't have it. If you were shooting, let's say some makeup for your makeup brand and you shot it on white and you had a shadow but you didn't like it, you could select or cut out your product and then add a new shadow to it for how you like, and then have it uniform across all your products. So they look nice and crisp, or they're in the right direction. So how you make a shadow is basically you go down to here, to the FX tool in your options, and you create a drop shadow. And generally I like using the default functions, which is everything's on 0 and whatnot, and it has a little bit of a shadow, and the angle is basically the angle. So you can, if you move that around, the shadow will slightly move the direction. Imagine the sun shining. Go back to roughly where it was, which is probably there, maybe there. You can adjust the darkness of the shadow up here. So it's very good. And you can also, with these three options, the size, the spread, and the distance, adjust the blurriness and how far it is. Like imagine the sun coming across, how far and how long the shadow is. So there are other options in there, but for the simple purpose of just making a simple shadow, that's what we've got. So I'll cancel that because we've already done it. So now I've learned how to cut stuff out, how to make a shadow. So we've done two things in this image. And all these other shots, which I'm going to add in. As you can see, there's a shadow. Everything has been cut out in the exact same way that I showed you. And then everything was given a shadow in the exact same way that we went through. And we ended up with this, which, just so you know, not every image was in the same orientation that it was in here. Some of them I've had to turn a little bit, which I'll show now how you do that. I'm going to click on this bad boy, which is our main oyster. And I'm going to press Command T. And I think on an PC or Windows, it's Control T. And it's called Transform Tool. So essentially you can transform the shape or orientation of your object or image. So essentially what I've done is from wherever I was, say the image came in like that, I've just adjusted it to where I think is good in my composition. Very simple, very useful tool, especially if you're creating layers and want to adjust things. It's even useful if you want to adjust your entire image. You can use this tool. There are options in here. If you hit Control, we are on free transform, but you can scale it up. You can make it something bigger. You can change the perspective. You can distort the edges. Depending on what you want. So you can flip it. See, it flips it. So these are all very basic things, but you can adjust an object or an image doing that. And the shortcut for that is Command T. So I've done that with each of these objects, especially the ice. I think I was, if I get back to my ice, Control T, I was very pedantic in making sure that I had the ice in the right spot in doing that. But again, most of the stuff I do in Photoshop, it's just by eye, what you think looks right. So that's another tool that I use a lot. So I've done the masking, done drop shadow, done transform tool. So I use those a lot. So let's minimize a bit of this. Next tool that I use a lot is these three. You've got your healing brush, or your content aware, which is basically an automated healing brush. You got your healing brush, you got your patch tool, and to a lesser extent, the fourth one is a clone tool. Clone tool is a direct copy. Back in the day when Photoshop first came out, these three weren't really a thing, and your clone tool was what you did most of your airbrushing or spotting with. So I can show you with something I don't like. So if I take a sample by pressing Option and clicking on the oyster, and then going onto this little red bit here, it goes away. Only problem with this clone tool was, as it was a direct copy, Sometimes they work quite well in getting rid of smudges and bits of dust, but often it would take a tone and a color and put it in a different area. Like this is a reddy tone, that's a blue tone. Doesn't work. So it wasn't perfect. But I still use it, still use it a bit, mainly in like areas where I know like black, where there's dust, or I know it's not going to matter too much. But where there's areas of texture, I like to use the healing tool. Now, before the automated healing tool, we had the original healing tool. And I'll show you what that does. So again, you have to select a spot. I'm going to get rid of this vein. Again, it's a bit like the clone tool, but it's keeping the color and tone of the image, but all it is getting rid of is the vein. And what that in the computer sense is thinking, it's getting rid of the darker pixels in the lighter pixels. So it's doing that for you. So, but only problem with this tool is, again, it is selecting off one spot. So what can happen when you do too much? Say you're editing someone's skin or just like a surface or a sky or something. What it does, it will repeat those same pixels that you've selected and put them everywhere. So if you're not constantly reselecting by pressing Option your source and then adjusting, eventually you'll see all these repeating pixels in your photo on a small scale, which is not ideal. So be aware of that. Also, when you're doing any of these healing and cloning tools, make sure your brush is relatively soft, just so it blends in better. Otherwise, it will leave a circle. The tool that I like using in this instance more often now is, and it's only come around in the past couple of years, is this one here. It's the automated tool. So there's a bit of, I don't think it's AI, but it's like the program's doing a lot of the thinking for you. And essentially all you have to do is click. And more often than not, it will work. So you can just see it's thinking itself. See that maybe that case didn't work too well, but you can see how it automatically takes samples from around the image without you having to actually constantly remember to press. And it does do things quite well. Sometimes it will stuff up, but you can see how it's just getting rid of the little blemishes that we're clicking on. And again, if something doesn't work like that, you can undo it in your history. And if you want a shortcut to this, you in Photoshop, if you just scroll over the top, it tells you. So it's J. J is the shortcut. And the clone, again, if you scroll over the top, S. Pretty much anything in Photoshop, if you scroll over the top of it, it will tell you the shortcut. Especially if you have the newer Photoshop, which is the 2020 version. And then the last selection tool, which is a bit rough, but if you're doing a bigger area, is the patch tool. So basically, essentially what it is, you select a patch, you move it on. It's a bit crude. Kind of works better with like skies. It could be quite useful in skies. You can feather it too, but essentially it's just taking a copy from one spot and putting it onto the other spot, like the heal tool. It's keeping the same colors, but it's changing the texture. So yeah. So there we have, that is your basically your airbrushing and healing and cloning. Those are the tools that you use. They're very simple, they're very basic. You'll use these more than anything, I'd say, because usually when most of you have opened up your picture out of Lightroom, you'll need to get rid of some dust or get rid of like maybe something in the sky you don't like, there's a bird in your image, any of those things. So like the brushing tool, the more you do it, the better you'll get at it, you get more of a flow for it. But just use those three tools and you should have a good understanding of which one to use at which point. So if anyone has any questions about that tool, let me know. But again, it's pretty basic. Pretty basic. Now, what else would I use in this image? So I've been through selection, I've been through the healing, cloning, color. Now, I actually don't do color in Photoshop. Usually the color is already how I want it from my raw processing. And the reason why I do that is I just don't want the image to deteriorate too much. So each of these images, I've actually, first of all, if I can find, just going to open this image up. Camera roll. So there is our oyster. And you can see it's a bit different. It's actually very different. But essentially what I've done is I brought the color up. So back in RAW, what I'm doing is I didn't save the settings when I did this. I'm just going to bring the colors up. To where I think will give me the most ability to bring the colors up in Photoshop. Someone got a question. How do you separate the healing tools as mine are all under one? Good question. Basically, all the tools and all the bars and everything in Photoshop is customized. If you go up to Edit, Toolbar, now we can customize the toolbar. So we can drag different tools into different sections or make their own section. So we can make all these in one section if we wanted to, or we could split them out. We could also get rid of tools that we don't use. I don't use the magic eraser. I don't use a background eraser. I don't use the smudge tool, so you can get rid of that. So, and then you just save it and you go done. If you don't like what you've done, you can always reset it to how it started out off as. Hopefully that answered that question. So yeah, we've got our original, we've got where we ended up. Now, how I got that oyster to looking how that was in the other way, it was not just because of adding some saturation and adding a filter on at the end. I actually did some lightening and darkening. So the main tool. This is probably along with the selecting tools and the healing tools, this is a very, very important tool that I use, is down here. Is the dodge and the burn. And just until lesser expense, the sponge tool. Dodge is what it means. It's lightening stuff in your image. Burn is darkening. And then sponge is desaturation or saturation. So in this image, I would have dodged this oyster. It's quite sharp, actually. So what I would have done is there's 3 different options in dodging and burning. You've got obviously your brush size and your hardness of your brush, which depends on the object you're doing. So adjust that accordingly. But the main one is the midtones, the shadows, and the highlights. I use all of these. I know what they all do. I have an understanding of a feel for them. So best way of doing is seeing what they do. So midtones is what it is. It's lightening most of the tones in the image. What it isn't doing, it's not affecting the highlights as much, and it's not affecting the shadows as much. I'm clicking in the shadow here, not much happening. Click on this highlight here. The highlight's still highlight, but the midtones around it are getting brighter. That's what a midtone tool does. Now there are options with this tool. You can make it stronger by turning up its exposure. You can see it do its thing. You can also turn off this defaulted thing called protect tones. I like to use it on and off depending on what I need, but the difference is what it says. With it off is just this blatant dodging. Do lots of clicks. It's a blatant dodging of what you're doing. If you turn it on, it actually protects the color and the tone in the image until you go too far. So you can see the difference. It's very subtle, but when you're doing stuff like as precise as this, I like switching between the two, because in some areas I just want the image to be brighter, but in some images I want the area of the image to be brighter, but I still want to keep the detail in the image. Difference between the protect tones is, one last thing is, you have it on, it will make the colors more saturated and brighter where you're touching, whereas the basic tool will not, keep everything quite neutral. So again, play with it and see how you go. And now this will be exactly the same for shadows and highlights, but I'll show you what shadows we've done. If you have a shadowed area like here and you don't want to ruin it, have your protected tones on, set your exposure depending on what you want. Let's just put it on 100 because it wasn't 100. And if we look, it's lightening up your shadows. But if we go into this area here, and clicking on this midtone, it's not really doing much at all. But in this darker area, it's doing a lot. So we can probably make the brush a bit bigger. We can probably do a bit of that. And like with the midtones, if you turn off the protecting tones, it doesn't protect the shadow. It just basically lightens up. But if you turn it on, it protects the image and the detail, but while lightening. That's a very handy thing to learn, and it will make your dodging and burning process a lot easier. And then lastly, the highlights. The highlight tool is very strong, even if you have it quite low. So even if we have this down at 20%, it's a very strong tool. It's probably stronger with the tones protected. See how it's just banging up the highlights. I often use it with it off. I find it's a bit less, or I just want the highlights to be a bit brighter. It's a bit less, see, it's a little less strong. But I'll switch between the two. So if I want to make this just a little bit brighter, I'm just going to click around. And that's what I want. And then I'll go to my midtones, put my protected tones back on, and just click until I get something that I think is a bit better than what I had. And then stacked under those two tools, and burn is exactly the same, but it's the opposite. So we can go back and we can burn something in across all those three: midtones, highlights, and shadows. The exposure is the same, protect tones is the same, it's just the opposite. And I'll use dodge and burn in conjunction with each other, depending on what I'm doing. And you might think, oh, is it only good for something like this where you're selecting an object and doing that? When I'm airbrushing someone's face or their skin, I'll use dodge and burn tool more than what I'll use the healing and clone tool, because if you're doing a lot of airbrushing on someone's face, you want it to look as natural as possible. You don't want it to look plastic. So the beauty of the dodging and burning tool is basically all it is doing is making pixels lighter and darker. And if you think of someone who has really nice skin, the only reason why they have really nice skin in the actual image is because their skin is all one tone. There are no dark spots and light. Well, there are limited dark spots and light spots in their skin, so their skin looks perfect. Rather than making it look plastic and smooth, you'll still have the hair or the hair follicles or the pores in their skin. But by darkening and lightening softly with your shadows or mainly your midtones, maybe some highlights, you can get a really even surface. So that's how you get rid of like bags under the eyes or pimples that are too big to clone out, stuff like that. Or shadows under the chin that gives someone a double chin. You can actually dodge that out by dodging out the shadow and the midtones. So when you think of this tool, you might think of it as a very basic tool, but it's actually very powerful. So definitely play around with the different options in the dodging and burning. And then the last thing that's in that section is the sponge tool. It's a color saturation and desaturation tool. We have it on saturation, but 30 is the amount, so that's flow. That's the amount we've got set on. And if I just go around like this, you can start to see the saturation go up, and vice versa. If I go desaturate, you can see they go down. You may ask why that is useful. Again, it's a very manual, precise way to saturate something. I often will use it if I've been dodging something. So if I've been in my dodge tool, and for some reason I've been dodging it with no protected tones, and I've got the lightness I want, but I'm like, oh crap, it's a bit washed out now. So I'll saturate that area that I worked on. Or I'll just do a mass saturation of an area just because I want it to be a bit more colorful, but I don't want to affect the other things. And then a bit of highlights. So that's the dodge, burn, and sponge tool. Again, very important. Practice makes perfect with this tool. It might feel a bit clunky at first. A very important thing is select the right brush size and the right softness of your brush. I generally don't use any of the specialty brushes that come in Photoshop. Again, that's more something for a graphic designer. We'll probably use that sort of thing, but for a photographer, not really needed. Because you've got to remember, Photoshop is not just for photographers; it's for everyone who uses a photo, which there are lots. There's lots of different types of design that use it: web design, graphic design, all sorts. So, yeah, that's that tool. So, I'm going to take a couple 5-minute break. I just need to go to the toilet and I need to let my dogs outside. So if everybody wants to just have a little break, grab a cup of tea or something to eat, I'll be back in, it's 12:30 now. So I'll be back at 12:35. Actually, we'll make it, we'll grab something to eat as well. We'll come back at 12:40. I'll be back at 12:40. So if everybody needs to go to the toilet, get something to eat, get a cup of coffee, do that now. And someone just asked, is lunch provided? Yes, it's provided by yourself. Sorry. So we'll see you all in 10 minutes. Okay, I'm back. Hopefully everyone got a coffee someday. I got a coffee and a cookie. It's the quickest thing I could get. Shorthand, don't really have any food in the house today, so I'll go to the shops after this. Right, where are we? An hour and 20 minutes to go. Making some decent progress. Any questions about anything? Even if I haven't mentioned it, I probably have some knowledge of any question you need to ask, just purely because I've been around Photoshop a long time, so I'll probably come across any problems that you guys have had in your dealings with using the program. Okay. So where we left off was basically getting to the point where we were dodging and burning, but I led into the sponge tool, which is colorizing our selection or our oyster. Oh, I've got a question. Yeah, the recording will be good to review. It's always good to go over steps. Someone asked about a few things. Someone also asked they're having trouble opening up 2 raw images at once. I can only think this is because, one, you're exporting the image from Lightroom into Photoshop. And if that's not the case, two, you're just double clicking on one thing. If you're in Bridge, you press Shift, select multiple, press Enter, you'll get more than one open. If you're in Finder or if you're in My Computer on I'll just share my screen. So here's my Finder. Here's some raw files. If I select those and then drag them into Photoshop, I'll select a few of these and then drag them down into Photoshop. Hopefully they'll drag. My hands are really cold, so it's having trouble moving. There we go. If you drag them into Photoshop like that, it'll open up 2 photos in RAW. Hopefully that answers your question. You shouldn't be getting that problem if you're following those things. So now, we've opened up this image in RAW, we did our adjustments in RAW. We've done our dodging and burning adjustments, and we've started to do some color. In the actual Photoshop space, that's saturation I've done a little bit of. That's kind of the limit of where I do my coloring. Alan asked about if I'm not working. Yeah, okay. Every photo that when I start doing an edit like this, one thing I did forget to mention is usually my photos start as JPEG, and I'll pick one and I'll start working from that. If it's going to have a lot of layers like this does, I will resave it as a PSD, as a standalone file. Now usually I'll call it something like master file or whatnot, and I'll work from that file. Or I'll keep my original JPEG, which I've saved out, so I have that. But I'll have this master file and then a PSD, which is a Photoshop file. And it is an uncompressed file that works fast in Photoshop. It works across all Adobe's products, but essentially it's an uncompressed file. And then a JPEG, you can't save a JPEG with layers. The JPEG has to be a flat image with no layers, just one image. So as soon as you start saving the JPEG, it will automatically ask you to select a format, and you can select TIFF or you can select PSD. I select PSD, and I work on it from then. You can also save out PSDs from Camera Raw if you know that you're going to work on multiple layers. But because it automatically prompts you when you're working on your JPEG, if you've got a layer, there's not much point. The quality you lose in doing that is there's not much. So the reason why I keep, another question, the reason why I keep the JPEG from Camera Raw purely is because if I want to go back to it, I don't want to have to save out, go find that file as a raw file, save it out again as a JPEG, and find it again. Sometimes I'll like overdo things in Photoshop. I need to go back where I started and resample, recopy. Sometimes the client wants to see the original file, but not the raw file. So that's the original raw file that I've adjusted, and not the one I've edited in Photoshop. It's just a system in place that I keep, so I have stages which I can always go back to. Because once you save and close a file, you lose all this history. You can't just go backwards and forwards. So if you have your raw files where you started, your JPEG is where you want the image to kind of be, minus any adjustments in Photoshop. Then you got your PSD, which is your final sort of master file, which you work on. And then you save it out as whatever you need to go on the internet or print. It's just a stage process. Means you can always go back. And if someone asks you a question, do you have that original, I like this image, but I think maybe the color is not, you can always go back and go, oh yeah, it's this. This is what I've done. So you can see what you've done without actually have to use the raw file. Because a lot of people who aren't interested in photography don't know how to use a raw file. Like graphic designers, some of them won't know how to use a raw file. Won't be able to open it. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question. So back to where I was with color, like people like to call it colorizing, or basically giving the color of the image. So if you can see these two images, where we were, there it is. So I've clearly added more contrast and more color on the image on the left, but I would have started out here. So how I do that is rather than doing it manually, the color in Photoshop, which you might say, oh, it's, you know, it's better because you get to do it manually, like I've been spruiking with all the other stuff. I don't like doing it that way, because with all the dodging and burning, selecting, that's a basic function which just helps you improve your image. Darkens, lightens, selects. You can, you know, gives you more control of the image. If you manually color or saturate your images in Photoshop, what ends up happening is you, without you knowing it, you get into a habit of treating all your photos with the same settings. And then all your photos look the same, which for me is a huge hate. I hate it when I see photographers who, they're really like, say like a food photographer, and they're really into like a dark, moody, browny sort of look, which can look great on some images, but they try to put it across all their images. It just looks stupid. It looks fake. How can all your images be dark and moody when some of them are shot outside and some of them are shot inside? So if you only have that knowledge of your settings that you've created to make an image more colorful, and this is where people, you might see on the internet, people might sell you presets for your Lightroom. That's their presets they're like using. So yeah, that's the reason why I don't do much color actually in Photoshop, purely because you get stuck in bad habits. Not only bad habits, you just get stuck in habits, which can make, I've had that problem in the past. It makes your work look very similar. And now I notice all the time with photographers. You can tell what they're doing in Photoshop, and then they're doing exactly the same in every image. So something to keep in mind. Unless you're always in Photoshop trying new things, you're going to do the same thing over and over again, because you're learning a skill and you're repeating it. With the other tools, it's a good thing, but with that coloring tool, it's not a good thing. To the point where I probably won't show you too much coloring in Photoshop. I'll show you after what I normally do. So I'll go back into Photoshop. And where are we? Okay. So what I do, and in previous workshops, I've shown people this, and it's no secret, people do it. I invested $150 in a little program which works in Photoshop as well as Lightroom. It's a plugin. It actually can open by itself, essentially like Camera Raw, but it kind of looks like Lightroom. And it's called Exposure 5. It's up on my filter programs, exposure software. And I use this for all my coloring of images. And essentially what it is, it has heaps and heaps of presets. You've got old films, you've got infrared, you've got black and white, you've got vintage, Polaroid, just presets. Like print film, like negative film. Like if I click on this one, you can see the before and after. It's subtle adjustments. It's just contrast and color. You can do it across a whole batch of images. Sorry. I had to share the right screen. Now you can see it. You should be able to see. Yeah, you got that. Should be able to see the screen now. It's called Exposure 5. So yes, you can see all these different options along heaps and heaps and heaps of options. It looks a lot like Lightroom, very much like Lightroom. You can run it without Photoshop being open, but you can actually have it as part of Photoshop and send your image from Photoshop to it. If I'm not actually doing any editing in Photoshop, I'll send my photos into this rather than going to Photoshop. If I don't have to do any cloning or editing like that, I'll just go straight to this from Camera Raw. I could go straight into this without using Camera Raw, but there's a couple of features, especially those transforming features that I like in Camera Raw, which make me still use it. So it's a little bit of double handling, but if you didn't have Photoshop, you just had Lightroom in this, or if you didn't have Lightroom, you could just use this. So that's a little tip if you don't want to spend money on those programs. But anyway, so yeah, this is what I do on my coloring. So let me zoom out. Works pretty much like Lightroom. Like if you scroll up and down, you can see all the sliders exactly like Camera Raw, exactly like Lightroom. Hue, saturation, luminosity, tone. You got your curves, your vignetting. You've got some other funny things like old school border, picture frames. You've got light effects if you want some flaring in your image. Texture, like if you want some there we go, some scratching, some scratches. You see the scratches? There we go. So all sorts of stuff. The beauty about this program is that once you select, so we'll select this Fuji Pro old school film profile. The beauty about this program is once you select something, you can adjust everything from where it is. So if you select something and it doesn't really work exactly how you want on the image, you can go through and manually adjust, tweak it so it matches what you're doing, which is brilliant. Really, really good. And this plugin goes into Photoshop and Lightroom for both. Once you buy it for one, it works on both. So it's called Exposure Software is the name of the company. Yeah, this is what I do on my coloring. And because I'm doing it every shoot, I will change which profile I use to match what I think I want. If I want something a bit more vintage, I'll do a vintage one. If I want something a bit more faded, or like something of cross processing, or something with a bit of soft focus, it's all. So it's a lot in there. You just go through and you just try things out. If it doesn't work. If you like the look of it, go with it. I think how I got that result from last one, I went to the cinema profiles and went down to this one called Technicolor, which is, I can show you the before and after. There's my before and after. So we can see our oyster that we've been working on. And we can go even a vibrant one. That's probably even better. There we go. Might take a little bit of orange out of that. So I'm just manually adjusting. So there, I've put on a color profile, and then in the old world, I've color graded my image. If I'm worried that my contrast is already correct, and then all I want is the color, I can go either to my curves, and I can just bring the shadows up. So I'm still getting that good color, but I'm not getting too much contrast. I can adjust that, maybe just a little bit. So that's where it's really good to be. It's very manual. And then if I'm like, I really want some more blue, I can go to these tools, which I've showed you in Camera Raw, and it's in Lightroom as well. I can show you, it's the same tools, so you have the same understanding. I'm just going to make those blues a bit bluer. Maybe the yellows, I'll make a bit yellower. Make the luminance on some of the blues a bit darker, so it's a bit more blue. So yeah, you can see how that works. And how I would use this on a single image is just go apply. Sharing, I'm just going to share Photoshop again. Back into Photoshop. And there we go. So we go backwards and forwards. You can see we're getting closer. I don't think I'll ever get as close as what I had in the actual original shot, but you can see how we're getting there. So what I'll do is I will send you guys the link to this plugin so you guys can check it out. You can actually you can get a free trial. Hopefully everyone can see that. And if you didn't get the link, someone asks, it is 30% off at the moment, which is good. So you probably get it for around $100, I'd say. And someone else, Tony asked, to use Photoshop and exposure at the same time on a file. Yes. Like I'm just swapping in between. Like I use it as a tool. Think of it, I use it as part of Photoshop. It's just a tool in Photoshop. You can use it by itself, but I use it as a tool. It's part of my process. Usually it comes at the end of my process, which is the last step, which is the color and a little bit of contrast just to finish the image off. If anyone didn't get the link to the file that I'm working on, it's in the Google Drive. I'll just send that again to everyone. If you didn't download the file at the start, I'll just send that again. Go back to my Photoshop. But even now, like you see, there still is a difference between the two oysters. They're not exactly the same. They're close, but I can tell that this yellow is actually more orange in my image that I finished with. So I must have got that to there and gone, no, I don't really like that. Maybe we can change that. We could go back and have a look in exposure and just see whether we can do it in there. Where are we? Exposure. We'll see whether we probably can do it in here. I'm going to go like in Camera Raw. It's these oranges and yellows that I'm worried about. I want to change. So I go to my hue and I'm going to focus on those tones a bit. I'm just going to move it, the slider around a little bit and get away from the yellow, and maybe add a little bit of luminance, maybe into the yellows. Let's see how we go. I might get closer. Go okay. I'll go back to Photoshop. Closer, definitely closer. No, not exact, but we're getting there. And remember, this is like a basic to complicated. We're getting into more complicated parts of this now, but we're using very simple techniques. And you know, I know there's like a lot of toing and froing going from one program to another. That's not, I don't use this process on every single shoot or every single image I do. This is just how complicated I will get when I'm working on a final image for something important, like this cover shot. So if that's all I can get out of my filter, there is one last step. And I said there was some color editing that you can use, that you can definitely use in Photoshop. And it is up the image. There's a couple of things. There's a hue and saturation, which is exactly what I just did in exposure. So I can adjust the hue and saturation of a color or all the colors. There's color balance, which is basically I can put a blanket color across my images. I can make them bluer, more yellow, more green. So I can do that. Don't need to do that because it's not needed. What I want to focus on is not the hue and saturation, which is there, which is very simple. Again, it's a hue and saturation slider, different colors. What I want to focus on, which most people won't use this tool or know about it. Down here, it's called selective color. And you remember back, I said about an hour ago that a photographer told me that the most important thing in photography is good selections. This is a way to select color very precisely. And we're getting to that stage in this photo where it needs to be kind of precise. I'm going to select that. It looks very similar to what we just came out of exposure and in camera raw, where there's the HSL, hue, saturation, luminance. But each color has 4 options underneath. And for people who haven't done studied photography at school or college or uni, the primary colors that we use are RGB, red, green, blue. The secondary colors that we use that go in conjunction with RGB are cyan, magenta, and yellow. So under or CMYK, which you might have heard before, CM, magenta, yellow, black, which is K. Just a little tidbit of, I don't know, photography technical history speak. But in terms of what it does is the reds, which we're focusing on, and the yellows, we can adjust. If there's any cyan or magenta or yellow in that color, we can adjust it. And the best way to see what it does is just move the sliders around. So we're moving, there are cyan pixels moving around. So we probably don't want that there. We'll move this one around. There isn't much magenta in there at all, so nothing's happening. There isn't much yellow in the reds. We're not talking about yellow in the image, talking yellow in the red pixels. And then the dark one, we definitely want to make that darker to get closer to the image that we were doing. Now I want to go to the yellows. Again, just trying to find a point that I think is close to what I had. So we can see I added a bit more darkness in the areas which I had here, and tried to get the color a bit closer. It's always hard when you're doing stuff from back to front because you can't save those intricate adjustments as you go once you close your file. So I'll never be able to get it exactly the same. That's why it's always important when you're editing to do it all. I like to do stuff all in one batch, because if you come back halfway through you're doing an important thing like color, you can your next image will be all out of whack because you won't have the same settings. But we're close. I think what was different is, I think maybe there's some hue and saturation in there. But before I show you that, I want to show you how earlier on, and tie it back into this, we had our layers and our selection and masks. I'm going to make a mask on this, but I'm not going to make a original. I'm going to go into this little tool here. It looks like the black and white cookie. And I'm going to make a hue and saturation mask. Now, the difference between this and a normal mask or anything, any of these tools, so you got gradients, levels, brightness, exposure, color, selective color. This is a mask, so it's not destroying the actual file. So you'll always have your original at the bottom if you need to. So you know where you started. So you can now save stuff out as a PSD, but still have some of the steps that you've done. And this will also remember the amounts you've done. So now you can have multiple images and have multiple adjustments. Hue and saturation, you can have some levels, and then you can match them up as you go along. That's where your consistency through multiple images in the same set, if you're doing these finite adjustments. And then once that brings up, you just click on it, and then we can see our exact same tools set. You can see it here. We're going to do some hue and saturation on the reds. Well, computer's chugging along a little bit. Might do some hue and saturation on the yellows. Back to the reds. And you can leave it. You don't have to press OK, save, it's there. Once you save your file, it will always be there in a PSD. And then the next thing about that, the beauty about that is, remember how we had our mask here? Just minimize this file. But we can actually paint or select the mask just to add the color to what we've selected. So I'm going to do a rough selection of our object using the selection tool. Wait, I'm going to click on the right layer. Always remember, you're going to click on the right layer. So there we go. It's roughly selected it. And if we went with the paintbrush, it would paint inside our object and apply the color to the outside. We don't want that. We want the object that was selected to have the adjustment. So you simply just go up to select and go inverse. So it will just spin that selection around. As you can see, there's a line around the edge. And you can either do a paintbrush and paint it in. You can do a fill tool and just get black. You get your fill tool here. G is the shortcut, and just go boom. And now you've got a perfect color selection on just one thing. You could also add that to the highlights, levels, I mean. And again, and now, if we click that, we've got perfect color selection because you've selected the object and you've got on a non-destructive mask, which means the file is still intact how it was. And you're able to make these changes in Photoshop on very specific things like color, tones, and whatnot. So that's very basic tools, but you're using it in a more advanced way and maybe a smarter way. And if you have lots of layers, so if I make this, unlock this bottom layer by double clicking on it, you could make, if you had lots of layers, you could make a little group. So this is group one, we could just drag all this into this group for this image. And then you can have another one. So if you want to be really organized, that's how you do that. Yeah, very, very simple but powerful, the selection tools with mixed in with the adjustment tools. And then, so I would have done that. I would have cut out our object, so which is the shape of the oyster. So I will just load that up. So remember, I go Control, Add Mask. I'm going to add it to the original. So that's all we have. And you can see how that automated selection tool actually worked pretty well. And the reason why it worked better in this file than the original is because this file wasn't dark. There was more tones to play. So it's actually, so that's quite quick. I didn't have to draw everything like I did before. So it wasn't as slow. But I wanted to show you how to do it from the basic form of editing out and selecting something to this, which is the automated version, which saves you lots of time. So it's good to see the difference. So that's what we had. So I would have that, and then on this file, I crop it because I only want a small part of that image. And I'd save it out, of course, but for this purpose, I'm not going to. I'm just going to drag it in. So I'd open up this, I'd click on this, drag it in. And there we go. It's too big, but easy. We've got a Control T, so transform tool, and we'll just put this in. Roughly where it was. I actually don't think this is the same image that I used. It's close. It's the same oyster, but it's probably in a different spot. You can also use the arrow tools to move things around in Photoshop, like we have done there. Press Enter. So it saves that transformation. So that one, we minimize that one because we're done with that. And still a bit of difference. Now, what that is that it's a bit of dodging and burning. So it would have been probably me using my shadows and going in. Oh, see how it's, no, I don't like that. Maybe we'll use it mid-tones. Remember they hit protect tones. And again, just lightly darkening things off. I'm only doing this because I want to match with what I did before, but you know, if you have been doing it for the first time, you won't know what you like until you see it. But yeah, I'm just darkening it off. So still a bit of difference, but it's kind of close. I remember on this image that I spent a lot of time just going backwards and forth. So this last little section, not just getting one oyster right. I wanted them all to fit in the same sort of color scheme and have the similar sort of shadows. So I spent a lot of time dodging and burning to get it how I liked. Like this oyster here, you could definitely see the oyster inside there, but I made a shadow by dodging it. Same with this one here. The shadow is not as pronounced as it is in the final one as it was in the original. And I would have gone in on the oyster, and I used a highlight tool, and I made sure I made the edges of the gills of this oyster really nice and highlighted, as you can see here in the image, just to make it look a bit more interesting and bring that detail up. So you can see how you can get very, very specific on something. In the end, you're probably the only one that's going to notice it individually. That's what that is. But the overall image, you might find it just looks better. And people won't know why, but it's because you spend that little bit of extra time just working on some subtle things, I mean. So we got to there. So that's what we've done. So that's how I brought every single shot into this image. And through that, I've shown you guys how to select, make masks, use camera raw, adjust your colors, use a plugin to do coloring, and then go back and then do it manually, dodging and burning. I'm trying to think other tools that I use, but those are the main ones I use. Oh, there is one other tool. This one's good. This is a good one. It's in your brush section. It's called your color replacement tool. Essentially what this does is if I select the color and hit Option click, it will remember that color, and then I can click in a different area where you see what's purple here, and it will add the color to the tones, but it will you can see how the detail is still there, but it's just changing the color. So I probably used a little bit of this in this photo, but it's very, very useful for a lot of things. Like, let's say I like that yellow and go to this image. And then I click that yellow here. So now we're getting closer to what that yellow looks like. And then I like that creamy color. And I go to here. And then we see how it changes colors, but keeps the original color. Very powerful tool, very simple, very manual, but can be super useful. Even when things like this, where the ice, say the ice is not perfectly black and white, you could just select a black tone and color over it and get it nice and neutral. So that's a very good tool. I use that all the time, actually. And then those are all the tools I use to do manual things in Photoshop. But you might want to ask, what happens when I want to do something to a lot of images? And I don't want to have to keep doing it at the same time over and over again. Now, there are limits to this, what you can do, but you can actually record your actions, which are these in your history. You can record them in Photoshop. So if we go back to this image, and remember how we went into exposure, and I'll go back in my history here and go before exposure. So if I wanted to record something, record an action, and it can be anything in Photoshop that doesn't involve like a specific thing to the image. So cloning, dodging, healing, selecting. You can't really action those because each image would be different. It wouldn't be in the same spot where it did it, remembered it, and probably wouldn't do it. But you can record simple things like cropping, resizing, color adjustments. But one thing I mainly use is I record my colorizing or my exposure software plugin. So I record it, and it should remember the last thing. So it remembers the last thing I did. So I apply, and it will remember it. Let the computer think for a second. Okay. So how this works, I'll show you again. You go actions, which is window, can't find it, actions. I've got a lot of actions here. Never usually use the same action twice, but you can if you want. I always go to a new one. But if you have some things you like doing, like resizing and stuff, like basic stuff, you can save them. But I make a new action, and then I go to whatever I'm going to do. But I know in this instance, I'm going to use my exposure software. It's the same adjustment as I made before, remembered it, but I could do a new one if I wanted to, but I'm not going to. I'm going to apply, and it's going to remember it. Takes a little time to process. These are big files. Then I'm going to go save as, and I will just go into my working, and I'll just save it in here. Quite a big file. I'm going to save as 8, still 5 megabytes. So go OK. You can see how it's recording it down here. Then I'll close the image, and then I'll stop the action. So now I have this action. Now, if you're in Lightroom, you could do a bulk selection and do this. But in Photoshop, because Photoshop is a work on an individual file program rather than work on a bunch of pictures, creating action is quite useful. So I can open up these two images here. They're in Bridge. There's the one we worked on. If I'm in Bridge or if I'm in Lightroom, select the ones I want to work on, and then I go Photoshop, batch in Tools. See that? So it's opening up from Bridge. This looks all good. Go OK. And then I can walk away. So if I have 100 files from a wedding that I want to have the same color on them, this is how I do it. So that's done. If it was 100, it would go ding, 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 and you could go do something else. You wouldn't have to keep on doing it over again. And then you can see, if I share bridge, you can see now they have the same color. And all I did was go up to Tools, Photoshop, Batch, and then OK. But you got to make sure you select the action that I made, which is 356, 356. So that's how you do that. Go back to Photoshop, which is here. Back to our image. And then finishing touches of this image was, oh yeah, the headline. Actually, I didn't, when I sent this to the mag, I didn't put the headline on that, I just wanted to, well, there was a reason why I did that, but I wanted to see how everything sat in the image. I know most of you won't be making stuff for magazines or whatnot, but it's just a way how you can add text into your images. So yeah, any questions about that? Anyone? So that's where the image was ready to go. So a lot went into the image, a lot of manual stuff. Also a lot of just actions with the color, and like the camera raw was all the same, saving everything out. And then the rest, I guess the artistic side was just laying out the composition of where everything I thought fit in an image. If you're working on a single layered image and you just want to adjust the color and take out some dust, of course you won't have to worry about that. But showing you this gives you a full breadth of taking those basic functions in Photoshop and building them into something really complicated. And I've also bypassed a lot of the tools in Photoshop that are there for different purposes and for different people. And I haven't showed you them. I mean, I could talk for 20 hours about all the things in Photoshop, but for people who are beginner and even people who are intermediate, it's just not needed, because I feel that the less time you can spend on Photoshop, the more time you can spending tech. You can take more photos and you can just have an actual life. The one thing I've learned from being on using Photoshop a lot is how to spend less time on it. So just being more efficient and cutting corners and using shortcuts where I don't need to do things, and then spending the time that I do spend on the more manual stuff that I know that I can't get done automatically. So it's a blend. And it's like anything, you just have to practice it and you'll get better at it. And you'll get a better understanding. I know me talking to you like this is sort of like, oh yeah, this is pretty complicated. Oh, that's good, good, good. And then when you try to do it, it might not match up, but just practice. Someone asked if I had a final image in mind before I began it. I didn't, but I had some, not feedback, I had some, in my brief, I had like, there was two things. I want it to look like I want it to look like a watch ad. I want to see the front and the back and the side of the oysters to make it look like they're falling. And I want to see some ice. And that was it. I went from there. And I actually think they rotated the entire shot upside down for the cover. So even though I wasn't right. with my layout. Like the art director must have gone, no, I think I like this, looks better with the text. So this is, I just came up in my head, but I was just making sure that I had enough. I didn't want too much going on, but I wanted some even spacing. I didn't want to be all uniform. And I was just looking at it and seeing what I liked. Once I got to that point, this is where things move out of Photoshop. And I'll spend the last 20 minutes talking about this because this is the fun part. So I'm going to close that. So if you guys want to play with this file, use it for reference, more than welcome. Please don't post this on Instagram or Photoshop. There's no need for that. But if you want to play with yourself, more than welcome. So the last bit I want to show you is what I did to it, which is if I open up, let me just find it for you in my files. Give me a sec. Just need to. It's in my movies. 24, 25th. Must be that one. All right, I'm going to share something with you. Let me just go to share screen. Just going to share my desktop with you guys. Okay, so this is a movie. And if you turn your sound on, I'll turn my sound on. I don't know if you get the sound from mine, but I'll turn it on. This was all made from those Photoshop layers in that image. This is for Instagram. So I'll press play. I don't do full screen. No, I can't. So there you go. So I was right. The designs actually did spin the image upside down, but I made this for them as well to go on the Instagram. So I animated my shot, and I can only do that because I had the layers separately done. So I will go into, I'm on an Apple, so I use a program called Motion, which is an Apple product. I'll share that screen with you now. I actually am doing a workshop on photography and animation later next month, or maybe in August, I think. It's just, it's past Photoshop, but you have to use it in conjunction with Photoshop to get it to work right with your photos. It's usually a software designed for people making animated text and stuff in videos. But I thought, well, I'm a photographer. I want to animate my photos. I want to learn how. So I just basically picked up the program and started mucking around with it. No, you can use, someone asked if you can use After Effects. Yeah, you can use After Effects. Same diff. I've got both on my computer, but I just did it in Motion because Motion was easier to learn at the time. I know how to use After Effects, but I didn't know how to use motion, so I did it in this. So After Effects is the Adobe program. I'm not sure whether I'll do After Effects or motion as a workshop. It depends on how comfortable I feel when I get to the workshop. I probably know motion better because it's a simpler program, but I do know how to use After Effects to an extent. I'm not like a video specialist, but I know how to use it in conjunction with my photos as a photographer, not as a videographer. Let's just see if I can find the file. That might be it. Hopefully that's it. No, that's not it. We'll close that. Should be here somewhere. It'd be a shame if I lost it. Dun, dun, dun. Give me a minute. Probably saved it in a folder. That's bizarre. I must have lost it. Well, that's a shame. Give me a minute. Let me just have a look around. Dang, I must have. Oh, wait. Motion dump. Is it here? Maybe one of these ones. Must have lost it. Which I don't know why that happened. Maybe it's one of these ones. No, it's gone as well. I must have lost it. That's a shame. But essentially, it's not part of Photoshop, but essentially it's when I get to the program, it has all the layers set up here and I just move them around. But I won't explain that in today's thing because it's way too complicated and I don't have time. Back to my desktop. So yeah, but in terms of what I was able to do, we could make from that what we did this. So that's just something you can do. So yeah, so we're coming up on 4 hours of talking, which has been a long time. I think I've run out of things to teach you. Before we finish, of course, this is being recorded, so you can later, and maybe not today, but at some point I will upload this, and George's will share it with you. But are there any questions about anything? Be happy to answer them. And if not, just watch the video. Everything I've done is it's very basic. So as you can see, it starts very basic, gets very complicated. So if there aren't any questions, I hope everyone has a good Saturday. It's sunny outside here in Sydney, so I might go outside and walk the dogs, but yeah. If no one's got any questions, anything really pressing, I'll call it a day, because I think I've talked enough. Hopefully, everyone got something out of that and can start using it in their work. Hopefully it wasn't too complicated. I try to keep it quite simple. All right. See you, everyone.